There are several ways to acquire a pot of gold. One way, for example, is to try and steal it from a leprechaun, but have you seen the movies? That shows you that that choice can be really unwise. Another way, much easier and safer, is to pick up your copy of the new issue of C3i Magazine, because each issue of this magazine really is a pot of gold for people that play GMT games, because you just have so many scenarios and new materials for your GMT games. Here there's new stuff for Combat Commander, SPQR, Flying Colors. Clearly for the cover there's stuff for Labyrinth. There is a new flowchart for Labyrinth. And then also it is a good read, designer notes, articles. Here there's also a tribute to Charles S. Roberts, a lot of good stuff. And as if that was enough, here you also have a complete game, which is a new edition of Battle for Moscow by Frank Chadwin. The game is not a new one. It was originally released in 1986 as a training teaching tool to show basic concepts of wargaming to people who didn't know them yet. There's a new, improved, revised edition by 3 Point Games, and now we also have the C3i edition with upgraded components. It is like meeting an old friend that all of a sudden looks much younger and more attractive than he did 20 years ago. The same cannot be said about me, so I have a little bit of mixed feelings, you know, why can the game do that and can't I? But that's beside the point. The game covers Operation Typhoon, Eastern Front, World War II. The game depicts the desperate attempt of the German army to take control of Moscow in late 1941. Two-player game. Clearly, one player will be the Russian side, the other player will be the Axis side. And the game was designed originally as a teaching tool, so as you can imagine, it has a small map, not too many counters, short and straightforward rules, plays fast. Well, let's take a closer look at the game now. As for the setup, the axes in which the players must position their units at the beginning are predetermined. There are no choices exactly on where to place the units, and the units of the Russian player are all exactly the same abilities, same values, so it really doesn't matter where a unit is placed as long as it is in one of the initial axes indicated by a red star. For the German player, things are slightly different, because the axes where a unit needs to be placed are predetermined, but then the units of the German player are different from one another. Some units are stronger or weaker, some units have different capabilities from other units, and the German player can choose where to place the units. So if you want to place the panzers here or here, where the infantry, where the strong units. So even though at the beginning the setup will look exactly the same as the one that you see here in terms of the general position, then within this setup the German player can actually try different strategies from game to game. Each turn consists of a German segment followed by a Russian segment, and each of these segments is divided in 4 phases. The first phase is the German replacement phase, and then later in the turn, the first phase of the Russian segment is the Russian replacement phase. During that phase, the active player will receive replacements following the schedule here outlined on the turn track. As you can see, the Russian player will receive way more replacement points than the German player does, which makes sense given the theme. A replacement point can be spent to flip a reduced unit to its full side, or to bring back into the game an eliminated unit, but in that case, the eliminated unit returns to the board with its reduced side up. Replacement points can only be spent on units that can trace a line free of enemy units and free of enemy controls to the supply sources, and the supply source for the German player is represented by this edge here, this with the solid black line, and for the Russian player an edge of the map that actually goes in the southeast of the map, and then all the way up here, and then also in the northeast of the map. And similarly, reduced units can be added to the map in cities that can trace an uninterrupted line to the supply edge of the map. The second phase in the German segment is the special movement phase, the Panzer phase. During this phase, the German player is allowed to move any and all of his units whose movement factor is printed within a red box, and these are the Panzer units, Of course, units move up to their movement allowance, and certain types of terrain will slow down their movement, but even more importantly, zones of control will be a factor. In fact, all units project a zone of control in the 6 axes surrounding them. When a unit enters the zone of control of the enemy, that unit has to end movement for that turn. Next turn can advance, but if it enters another zone of control, then it has to stop again. And this is particularly important, especially for the Russian player, because the Russian player really needs to make good use of the zone of control idea in order to slow down the German advance. Once the German player has finished moving any and all of his panzer units that he decides to move in that phase, remember during that phase only the panzers move, the other units do not, well, at that point the game enters the German combat phase, in which the German player can attack adjacent enemy units with his units. At this point, yes, also with the non-panzer units and with the panzer units as well, all of his units can attack. Combat is never mandatory, and it is always between any number of units that are adjacent to one enemy unit. In this case, for example, you could have these two people attacking that guy, or all of these people combining their power against that poor guy, or just dividing the combat factors differently, ganging up differently against the enemies. And combat is a pretty traditional, probably already figured out. You total together the combat factors of the attacker, you divide those by the combat factor of the defender, you find an odds ratio that will correspond to a column on the combat table. Terrain may lend modifiers to that. Usually that means that the defender may gain column shift that are advantageous to him. For example, woods will give a column shift that is advantageous to the unit that defends in it. The combat table will tell you if the defender must retreat. Retreat is always by 2 hexes, and then the attacker can enter the hex which is vacated. Exchange, which is brutal, the defender loses a step, and then the attacker needs to lose enough steps to match the combat strength that was lost by the defender. No effect. Attacker loses a step, defender retreats and loses a step, or defender is eliminated. Now, as you can see, this is one of those combat tables that make it particularly hard to eliminate an enemy unit just by a brute strength. You need to really put together a huge, powerful attack, and also to be lucky with the dice. So the safest and most effective way to eliminate an enemy unit is to force that unit to retreat through or into an enemy zone of control. A unit retreating through a zone of control loses a step for each such X that is entered, and a unit that is forced to end a retreat in an enemy zone of control is simply eliminated. So see, this game really has many factors that emphasize maneuvering, and in particular that invite the players to try to encircle one another, because if you encircle your enemies, or in any case if you maneuver well, you project zones of control around the enemy units, then you slow down the movement of the enemies, you cut off certain areas from supplies so that new units cannot be brought in the game, so replacements cannot be spent to improve units that are in that area that you managed to cut off by using your zones of control, and those areas are extremely dangerous because units that are forced to retreat when in such areas then are at high risk of being eliminated through a retreat. Last phase in the German segment is the standard movement phase, in which the German player can move any and all of his units, including the ones that moved during the special movement phase. The Russian segment follows a sequence that is almost identical to the German segment. The first phase is the replacement phase, in which the Russian player gets to flip units back or bring back units. After the Russian player has allocated replacement points, then the Russian player enters the Russian special movement phase, during which the Russian player can move any and all of his units which are sitting on railroad axes, and he can move them up to their movement allowance, but only following using railroad axis. So yeah, this is railroad movement. That's kind of like intuitive. So the Russian player really needs to be familiar with the railroad net on the map. Then you have the Russian combat phase, and that works exactly like the phase for the German one, but now the Russian player is the attacker, the German player is the defender. You resolve all combat, and after that you have the Russian standard movement phase, during which the Russian player can move any and all of his units up to the movement allowance, going wherever he wants. He doesn't have to follow railroads at that point. And during the standard movement phase, he can also move the units that he moved earlier. During the special phase, he can move them again. Historical flavor as well as strategic challenges will come from these two turn boxes here, which are brown, to remind the players that during turn 3 and 4 you're going to have mud on the map. That means that during mud turn, the movement of all units is reduced to 1 hex per phase, with the exception of Russian units moving by railroad movement only. So clearly that gives quite an advantage to the Russian player in a moment where that advantage is very much welcome, because in the first 2 turns probably the Russian player will have been taking a lot of hits from the advancing Germans, and now the Russian player has the option of reorganizing his army while the Germans are swimming in mud. He can move his units around, move fronts, reorganize forces. Also the fact that the Germans will not be attacking as much during those turns. I mean, probably the German player will not be able to mount as many attacks while he's swimming in mud. Then the replacements that are brought in are somewhat emphasized, because, well, they don't get destroyed as soon as they enter the map. So again, they can really be organized in a powerful force. And these 2 turns fall more or less in the middle of the game, which has a total of 7 turns. So they can really be a turning point in the overarching narrative of the game. The length of the game is of 7 turns. If at the end of turn 7 the Russian player controls Moscow and 1 other city on the map, at least 1, then the Russian player is the winner. If the German player controls Moscow, he is the winner. Nothing else is necessary. That's the winning condition. It may be that actually neither of those will apply. It may be that the Russian player still controls Moscow, but he doesn't control any other city on the map. Well, in that case, the game is a draw. This is a game that stood the test of time, and definitely for a reason, because it is a game that will probably surprise you. The first thing is that this is one of those games where the simplicity of the rules really has nothing to do with the complexity of gameplay. There's no proportion whatsoever. The game starts with something that looks like a static, claustrophobic situation, and maybe even repetitive, because there are only limited ways in which the German player can alter setup. And then each game will develop in different ways. The game feels very dynamic, has an interesting flow, the pace is very fast. When I have to explain the phases, it might have sounded like a lot of passages, but actually they're all very organically integrated in one another. So the game really has more replayability than you would expect, and forces you to develop interesting strategies. Maneuvering and positioning is extremely important, thanks to the combat table, which is what it is, which is that it's not good enough. You have to work around it and exploit retreats if you really want to inflict significant damage on your opponent. The game has an interesting flow, an interesting narrative, and definitely a good historical feel, and without feeling scripted, really. I mean, you don't have artificial rules that force you to do this or that. So this is really a game that has a great value to me. It is fun, it is interesting, can be played with non-war gamers, but I think the war gamers really can find in here enough to sink their teeth in it and to have fun doing that. So it's a really good game, and now we also have it in this even prettier version. So it comes with a good magazine. I think they really make a good package together. To me, is a no-brainer. This is definitely a good buy. By which I mean a good BUY, not goodbye. Oh, for today, goodbye.